Welcome back to Raul Effect. Today, we're going beyond surface behavior to uncover the hidden psychology behind avoidant attachment and why understanding it can completely change the way you see love and relationship. What if the distance you're experiencing isn't a lack of love, but a nervous system trying to protect itself? What if the silence you've been taking personally has far deeper psychological roots than you ever imagined? Tonight, we're uncovering the hidden truth about avoidant attachment and why understanding it can completely change the way you see relationships, connection, and emotional closeness. There is something important that many people overlook when they become involved with someone who has an avoidant attachment style. What you see on the outside is often only a small part of what's really happening. Beneath the silence, distance, or emotional withdrawal is usually a protective system that was built long before you ever entered their life. What looks like emotional detachment is not always the absence of feelings. Silence doesn't automatically mean they no longer care, and pulling away isn't always proof that love has disappeared. In many cases, the deeper issue isn't love itself, it's what love awakens inside them. For many people with avoidant patterns, real intimacy doesn't immediately feel safe. Instead of bringing comfort, it can trigger a sense of losing control. Being deeply understood, feeling emotionally exposed, or sensing that someone is getting too close can create pressure inside their nervous system that becomes difficult to manage. Because of that, they often distance themselves from the emotional intensity rather than from the person they care about. If you've ever watched someone become more distant as affection increases, withdraw after moments of closeness, or seem colder once the relationship becomes more serious, there's usually more happening beneath the surface than most people realize. This isn't simply about selfishness, emotional immaturity, or a lack of love. It's about the way their nervous system has learned to interpret emotional closeness. Instead of experiencing intimacy as safety, their mind may unconsciously register it as something overwhelming. The purpose of understanding this isn't to excuse unhealthy behavior or ignore your own needs. It's to understand what their protective system is trying to defend, why closeness sometimes feels threatening to them, and what allows genuine emotional openness to slowly develop. One of the biggest misunderstandings about avoidant behavior is assuming it reflects emotional emptiness. Many people see distance and conclude that the person doesn't care or isn't capable of deep attachment. Psychologically, that's often an incomplete picture. Underneath those defenses is frequently someone who feels deeply, but has learned to protect those emotions because earlier experiences taught them that closeness could lead to pain, pressure, disappointment, or the loss of personal freedom. As a result, intimacy can unconsciously become associated with obligation instead of comfort. The current relationship may be healthy, but their nervous system is reacting to old emotional patterns rather than the present moment. When those old patterns become activated, creating distance feels like the safest way to regain emotional balance. That withdrawal isn't always a rejection of you. Very often, it's an attempt to regulate internal overwhelm. Their nervous system is trying to reduce emotional intensity before it becomes too much to handle. Inside many avoidant individuals exists a quiet conflict. Part of them genuinely wants love, connection, and closeness. Another part fears becoming too dependent, too vulnerable, or losing their sense of independence. Those two needs can exist together, creating behavior that seems confusing or contradictory. As emotional intimacy grows, they may not experience greater comfort. Instead, they begin feeling watched, emotionally exposed, or trapped by expectations. While their partner experiences growing closeness, they may experience growing pressure. When that pressure reaches a certain point, stepping back becomes their way of restoring inner stability. That doesn't necessarily mean they want to leave. Often, they're simply trying not to lose themselves inside the relationship. Another misunderstanding is believing that every period of distance means the relationship no longer matters. For many avoidant people, time alone serves an important psychological purpose. When emotions become too intense or constant interaction starts feeling overwhelming, they create space to calm their nervous system and regain emotional control. For them, space doesn't always mean emotional separation. It often means emotional regulation. Even while they're physically distant, attachment can still exist. Care can still be present. love may still remain. Their ability to stay emotionally engaged simply becomes limited when their internal system feels overloaded. Understanding avoidant behavior requires looking beyond what appears on the surface. What seems like inconsistency is often a repeated cycle between seeking connection and protecting themselves. What looks like emotional withdrawal is frequently an attempt to manage internal stress rather than eliminate the relationship. Recognizing this doesn't mean accepting unhealthy behavior or abandoning healthy boundaries. Those boundaries still matter. What changes is the interpretation. Instead of immediately assuming, they don't care about me, you begin considering that they may be struggling to remain emotionally regulated while experiencing closeness. That perspective changes the entire conversation. It replaces confusion with understanding without ignoring reality. If you want to understand avoidant attachment more deeply, it's important to look beneath the visible behavior and explore the psychological structure driving it. Every withdrawal, every period of silence, and every need for distance usually follows an internal pattern that makes much more sense once you understand how their emotional system works. Their silence doesn't automatically mean love has disappeared. Their distance doesn't always reflect resentment. Their need for space isn't necessarily a sign they're preparing to leave. In many situations, it's simply the way they restore emotional balance before they feel capable of reconnecting with greater calm, clarity, and stability. Once you understand that, you stop treating every moment of withdrawal as the end of the relationship and begin seeing it for what it often is: a protective response from someone whose nervous system is trying to feel safe while learning how to stay close. When you begin to understand avoidant attachment more deeply, you stop seeing every moment of distance as the beginning of the end. Instead, you recognize that for many people with avoidant patterns, time alone is often a way to calm their nervous system before they feel ready to reconnect. What appears to be emotional withdrawal is sometimes nothing more than a temporary reset. To truly understand someone with avoidant tendencies, you have to look beyond what they're doing today and consider what shaped them long before you met them. Many avoidant individuals grew up in environments where emotional safety wasn't reliable. Their vulnerability may have been ignored, criticized, or dismissed. Expressing sadness might have been met with indifference, while wanting closeness could have been labeled as being too sensitive or too needy. In some families, affection was conditional. Love was offered only when expectations were met, emotions were hidden, or they didn't ask for too much. Over time, those repeated experiences create powerful emotional conditioning. Their mind quietly learns that depending on someone can lead to disappointment, and opening their heart can result in rejection or emotional pain. As a result, emotional distance becomes a survival strategy rather than a personality trait. They begin trusting themselves more than other people, not because they don't value relationships, but because independence once felt safer than vulnerability. Gradually, they learn to hide their needs, avoid relying on others, and build emotional walls that are difficult for anyone to cross. From the outside, this can look like emotional coldness or detachment, but underneath, it's often the result of someone who discovered very early that closeness sometimes came with consequences. Distance isn't always chosen because it feels good. It's often chosen because at one point in their life, it was the only place where they felt emotionally safe. One of the biggest mistakes people make in relationships with avoidant partners is trying to calm their own fears by increasing emotional pressure. When uncertainty appears, they send more messages. When they notice distance, they ask for more reassurance. When they feel the other person pulling away, they try even harder to bring them back. Questions like, do you still want this relationship? Where is this going? Or, why are you acting this way? Usually come from a sincere need for clarity and security. But an avoidant person may experience those conversations very differently. What feels like an honest attempt to connect can feel like emotional pressure to someone whose nervous system is already overwhelmed. When they feel pushed to respond before they're emotionally ready or pressured to define feelings they haven't fully processed, their protective instincts automatically activate. Instead of moving closer, they retreat. Instead of becoming more emotionally available, they shut down. Not because they don't care, because in that moment, protecting themselves feels more urgent than connecting. This creates a painful cycle that many couples experience. One person becomes anxious and reaches for more closeness. The other feels overwhelmed and creates more distance. The harder one partner pursues reassurance, the more strongly the other feels the need to step away. In many situations, it isn't the relationship that pushes an avoidant person away. It's the emotional intensity surrounding it. Ironically, what often encourages them to reconnect isn't urgency or repeated demands. It's the experience of emotional safety. Someone with avoidant patterns is much more likely to move toward connection when their nervous system no longer feels like closeness threatens their independence or emotional stability. Real initiative doesn't usually appear while they're overwhelmed. It begins once they feel safe enough to believe they can stay close without losing themselves. Understanding what happens after withdrawal makes this pattern even clearer. Many people mistake avoidant withdrawal for complete emotional disinterest. Psychologically, it's often something different. It's a process of emotional deactivation. During this phase, their attention turns inward. They're trying to reduce emotional stimulation and restore their sense of autonomy. That's why they may seem distant without disappearing entirely. They might still send occasional messages, but avoid emotionally intense conversations. They may continue caring deeply while struggling to express that care in ways that feel reassuring or consistent. Naturally, this inconsistency creates confusion. When people don't understand what's happening, their minds often assume the worst. They've lost feelings. They're replacing me. They don't care anymore. But avoidant attachment rarely works in such a simple, linear way. Their emotional system isn't turning love on and off. It's constantly shifting between the need for connection and the need for self-protection. Another important point is that avoidant individuals often experience love very deeply. The difference is how their nervous system responds once intimacy crosses their internal comfort zone. When emotional closeness begins feeling too intense, their brain can interpret it as losing emotional control. Not control over another person, but control over their own sense of safety, freedom, and personal space. Even when nothing is objectively wrong, their internal alarm system may react as though something needs to change. Most often, that adjustment looks like silence, emotional distance, or reducing contact for a period of time. This is also why reassurance by itself doesn't always solve the problem. While comforting words may temporarily reduce anxiety, they don't automatically change the deeper emotional programming. If their nervous system still believes closeness equals pressure, the same cycle usually repeats. Breaking that pattern requires something much more patient. It requires consistency without emotional escalation. It requires giving space without using that space as punishment. And it requires emotional steadiness that quietly communicates safety instead of demanding immediate reassurance in return. Over time, when someone with avoidant tendencies repeatedly experiences a relationship where their independence is respected rather than threatened, something inside them gradually begins to change. Their nervous system slowly learns that intimacy doesn't always lead to overwhelm, that emotional closeness doesn't automatically mean losing themselves, and that love can exist without constant pressure to prove, explain, or perform their emotions. This is where genuine reconnection usually begins, not because someone chased them, not because they were convinced, but because their internal sense of safety slowly expanded enough to make closeness feel possible. At the same time, it's important to stay realistic. Not every avoidant pattern develops into a healthier relationship. Sometimes those protective patterns are deeply rooted, and the cycle continues no matter how patient or understanding the other partner becomes. Recognizing that truth is just as important as understanding the psychology itself, because healthy relationships require both compassion and clear boundaries. In some relationships, the distance doesn't continue because love has disappeared. It continues because the person's nervous system still isn't able to remain comfortable with ongoing emotional closeness. Understanding that difference changes everything. It shifts your attention away from blaming yourself or trying to control the relationship, and helps you recognize what is actually within your control and what isn't. At its heart, this dynamic isn't simply one person chasing while the other runs away. It's often two nervous systems searching for safety in opposite ways. One person feels secure through closeness. The other feels secure through space. Both are trying to reduce emotional discomfort using the coping strategies they learned long ago. Once you see it this way, The relationship stops feeling like a mystery that can be solved by trying harder. Instead, it becomes a pattern that requires awareness, patience, and emotional maturity from both people. Avoidant attachment isn't usually the absence of emotion. More often, it's a strategy for protecting emotions that once felt unsafe to express. The distance, inconsistency, and confusion that follow are often rooted in experiences where vulnerability led to pain, rejection, or overwhelm. Looking through that lens changes the question entirely. Instead of asking, "How do I make them stay?" a healthier question becomes, "Can this relationship become emotionally safe for both of us?" Only when both people feel emotionally safe can consistency begin to grow into something lasting. People with avoidant tendencies often become more open when they no longer feel pressured to respond immediately, manage someone else's emotions, or sacrifice their independence just to keep the relationship intact. Safety is what allows their defenses to soften. But that safety isn't built through promises or reassuring words alone. It's created through consistency over time. It comes from behaving in ways that match your words. It comes from remaining calm instead of reacting every time they need space. It comes from respecting their pace without abandoning your own emotional needs. As they gradually realize that needing space won't automatically be treated as rejection, betrayal, or a reason for conflict, something begins to change inside them. Their nervous system slowly relaxes. When that protective state starts to settle, genuine initiative often appears naturally. Not because they were pressured, not because they were convinced, but because they finally feel emotionally safe enough to move closer on their own. Avoidant people rarely respond well to emotional force. They respond much more consistently to emotional safety. When they experience a relationship where they can remain themselves without constantly defending their independence, they slowly begin seeing closeness differently. Connection no longer feels like something that takes away their freedom. Instead, it becomes something they can experience without fear. This is where emotional neutrality becomes so important. Many people misunderstand this idea and assume it means becoming emotionally cold. It doesn't. Emotional neutrality simply means staying emotionally regulated. You still experience sadness, disappointment, anxiety, or fear. The difference is that you don't allow those feelings to immediately control your actions. Instead of turning anxiety into pressure, instead of turning uncertainty into demands, instead of expecting the other person to immediately calm your emotions, you stay connected to yourself first. For someone with avoidant tendencies, this kind of emotional steadiness feels much safer because they no longer feel responsible for managing both your emotional overwhelm and their own. Imagine the difference. Instead of saying, "Why are you ignoring me? Do you even care anymore? Tell me what's happening right now." You might calmly say, "I can tell you need some space. I'm here whenever you're ready to talk." The words matter, but the emotional energy behind them matters even more. One response communicates urgency and pressure. The other communicates patience, confidence, and emotional security. It allows connection without creating emotional intrusion. At the same time, it keeps you grounded instead of abandoning yourself. That calm presence is often what gives an avoidant person enough safety to slowly lower their defenses and reconnect. When they begin feeling secure in a relationship, the changes are usually quiet rather than dramatic. You probably won't hear grand emotional speeches overnight. Instead, you'll notice small shifts. They may start reaching out without being prompted. They ask deeper questions. They suggest spending time together instead of waiting for you to initiate. They slowly reveal parts of themselves that were once carefully protected. Perhaps the most meaningful change is how they return after creating distance. Instead of coming back with the same emotional wall, they often return with slightly more openness, greater sincerity, and a little more willingness to connect. To someone expecting dramatic declarations, these moments may seem insignificant. Psychologically, they're anything but small. They're signs that the nervous system is beginning to believe closeness doesn't always lead to danger. They're evidence that old protective habits are slowly being replaced by trust. Even something as simple as sending a thoughtful message after a period of silence can represent a major internal step forward. Behind that small action may be a quiet battle between fear and trust that finally ended with connection winning. That's why understanding subtle behavioral changes matters so much when you're dealing with avoidant attachment. Small external changes often reflect very meaningful internal growth. But understanding must always be balanced with healthy boundaries. Sometimes people learn about avoidant attachment and swing too far in the opposite direction. They become endlessly patient. They tolerate emotional inconsistency. They ignore their own needs while hoping understanding alone will eventually transform the relationship. That's not healthy either. Real emotional growth never requires one person to continuously sacrifice themselves. Helping someone else feel safe should never mean abandoning your own emotional well-being. Understanding why someone withdraws doesn't mean accepting repeated emotional unavailability, unclear communication, or remaining in constant uncertainty without accountability. Compassion should never replace self-respect. You can understand someone's fears while still recognizing when their behavior is hurting you. Real emotional maturity means holding both truths at once. You can acknowledge their wounds without dismissing your own. You can understand their protective patterns without excusing repeated behavior that damages the relationship. You can remain compassionate without disappearing inside someone else's healing process. You can stay patient without losing yourself. You can remain calm without accepting emotional imbalance as your normal reality. True emotional safety isn't created by ignoring your own needs. It's created when both people feel secure enough to remain authentic without fear. That is the balance worth protecting. No chasing, no controlling, no rescuing, and no abandoning yourself simply to preserve a relationship. At the heart of avoidant attachment is usually a history of emotional experiences that taught someone closeness could become overwhelming or unsafe. Their silence often carries the weight of old experiences where emotions weren't welcomed, understood, or handled gently. Understanding this dynamic isn't only about helping someone else. It's also about transforming your own approach to relationships, becoming calmer, more emotionally grounded, more aware of your own boundaries, more secure in your own worth. Because while it's meaningful to love someone who is still learning how to remain emotionally present, you should never lose yourself while waiting for them to find that place. In the end, understanding another person's psychology is valuable, but protecting your own emotional health will always matter just as much. Healthy love isn't built through pressure or control. It's built through emotional safety, mutual respect, consistency, and two people who are both willing to grow without asking the other to disappear in the process. Understanding avoidant attachment is not about excusing harmful behavior. It's about seeing the deeper emotional patterns behind it while protecting your own peace. The healthiest relationships are built on mutual safety, respect, and consistent effort from both people. Stay grounded, honor your own boundaries, and remember that real love should help you grow, not lose yourself. Until next time, take care of yourself, and I'll see you in the next video.